Hey guys, Wes here. So in this video we're going to finally finish up our .NET Core MVC library management system project. So we're going to finish building out the business logic as well as the web layer in this single video. I've also got another project in the works to show you how to build an automated testing framework which will make use of Selenium and the Koipu wrapper. And I think that should be pretty interesting to use with our library management system application. So with that, I hope you enjoy the video, and be sure to leave any comments or questions below. Also notice that I have a link to the GitHub now, which will be in the description of this video and the other videos in this series. Alright, thanks for watching. Okay guys, welcome back to our .NET Core MVC library management system web application project. When we had left off in the third video, we had just completed most of our business logic here for our checkout system. So we have the ability now to have patrons check items in and out of our library as well as place holds on them, which if you recall is a sort of queue type system where a user can place a hold on an item, and then once it's checked in, if that item is checked out, the patron with the oldest hold on the item will then get that item automatically checked out to them. Alright, so if you notice when we fired up the application, we had our catalog page working and then the item detail page along with some of our checkout sort of views working. What I'd like to do is to create the front page, so the sort of landing page for our application, and just kind of get that out of the way. So there's not going to be much logic to that, but in fact when we visit our home controller, we have some controller actions here that were provided to us, sort of scaffolded out when we created a new MVC project with Visual Studio. And so we've got actions for about and contact and error as well. For now I'm going to go ahead and actually remove these just because they're not explicitly used in our application. And a control period here to remove unused usings as well. And you can see that the index action is just simply returning a view without passing any model to it. And that's fine because it is sort of just a presentational type view. And so what we can do is we can head over into views, and under home you can see that we have views corresponding to each of those controller actions. So I'm going to remove the about.cshtml and the contact as well. And then we'll open up index.cshtml. And what you'll find here corresponds to what we saw when we started the application. So we have this razor syntax again here where we have this sort of razor object, and in our view data array at the title index we have this home page, and in our view data dictionary here at the title key we have home page. So this is sort of razor syntax allowing us to reference this title elsewhere in our template here. So we can just go ahead and change this from home page to Lakeview ILS, or Lakeview Integrated Library System. You can change that to whatever you like as well. I'm going to go ahead and just create a simple heading here, and then we can reference it here by just saying view data and using the key again. So when this renders, it's going to say Lakeview ILS here now in a heading 3 tag. Then I'm just going to remove the rest of the template actually. And in fact, if we briefly fire this back up, and in fact, if we briefly restart our server, we can kind of take a look at the home page now. And so this will load in just a moment. And yeah, so we don't see anything here. In fact, I believe it's just hiding behind our nav bar. So if we take a look here, yeah, we can see that our heading is just hiding behind our navigation bar. I'm going to leave the browser open. So I'm just going to leave the browser open while we're working in the view because we don't actually need to recompile any code. And if you recall, all of our views are getting rendered inside of a template that the entire application shares. And so what we're going to do is over in our views folder under shared, head and take a look at the layout.cshtml file. You can see here that this is actually where we're referencing our global style sheet, which is located in our www root directory under CSS, and then we have this styles.css. So that's getting referenced here in our layout, as well as a reference to some various CDNs. So we have a material design CDN as well as some Google fonts as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to remove everything inside of our body tag, including the render body method, which we need to call to actually render our various views. So I'm going to go all the way down, and I'm just going to stop short of these two render section razor methods that get called here. And we're actually going to write this part from scratch here. So we're going to use a little bit of material design here. We're going to have a div that wraps sort of the entire layout. So we'll have MDL-layout, MDL-JS layout, and MDL-layout-fixed header. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the CSS that's used in this application because we have quite a lot of ground to cover over this video and probably the next video. So we're just going to go ahead and get this in place, and then if you have any specific questions about what is going on here, feel free to leave those questions in the comments below. Okay, so then I'm going to have this header class, custom header, MDL layout, _header, MDL layout, _header, -- waterfall, and then we'll have a div with class MDL layout, _header row. And so in our header, we'll have, in this case, not necessarily a logo, but just a span that's going to contain the title of our library system. So and we're going to give it an anchor tag that just points to the root. And here's where we'll just say Lakeview Library ILS. We could store this in a view bag, for instance, as we did here, on the index page, this view data dictionary. But I don't mind concretely typing it here in this case. And we'll have a div for a bit of a spacer. And then we'll have our navigation area. And in our navigation, we'll have anchor tags for each of the sort of four main areas of our application. So we'll have the home page, then we'll have a link to the catalog, our patrons, and our library branches. And here we can use that ASP controller, just point it to the home action, the home controller, and then we can use the ASP action and select the particular action on that controller, which we just saw was index. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that a few times here. And so we'll have links to our catalog, patrons, and branches. So what I was saying is that these will obviously have different controller actions as well. So we'll have a catalog controller, as we already have, and then we'll also build out our patron controller and our branch controller. And each of those will have an index action on them that will take us to sort of the root level, if you will, of those views. Okay, so that should take care of our header. And now let's just build a little section here for our page content. This is where we'll call our render body method. And so inside this div, we just call render body. Okay, and we still have our render section for rendering our scripts and our styles as well. Okay, so that's looking all right. So you can see now that we've refreshed the page, we have the new nav bar at the top. And it looks like we still need to do some styling here on our fonts. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to minimize this, and then we'll head into our www root and then into our styles.css style sheet. And I can see that we're referencing this font Coda. And then if I head over into our layout, it looks like we should be bringing that in. So let me make sure that this reference is not broken. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this And we'll head back into the browser. And yeah, it looks like we're missing some fonts here. So let's go ahead and revisit. So it should be at fonts.google.com. So we'll bring the same fonts back in, but this is good because we'll need to actually update our URL to this CDN here. We'll go ahead and add this. And so previously I was using Coda and then material plus icons. So I think that this has changed. Let's go ahead and also make sure that our style sheet that we're loading here, that's giving us access to some of the material design, is active. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that, and we'll head back over and we'll check the status of this as well. Oops. Okay, so yeah, this looks like it's working. And so this is getting served up from getMDL.io, which is our material design light CDN. So that's going to help us add some material design type styling to our web app. And so it looks like I just need to go ahead and update our Google Fonts reference. And so yeah, actually the URL was almost correct. It looked like perhaps the material plus icons is what it was upset about. Yeah, so this icon query here. So if anyone else is aware of where this is coming from, I'd be interested to know. I don't remember exactly where I got this link to begin with a few months ago. For now, we're just going to go ahead and use the straightforward CDN and just go ahead and grab the Coda font. And now we're going to go take a look at our page again. So I'll close these and I'll shift reload here. And so that looks a little bit better. Now we can go ahead and finish out our landing page. So our template's working. In fact, if we visit our catalog page, for instance, we can see that the template is still working. So that looks pretty good. Okay, I'm also going to close the page inspector for now, and we'll minimize the window. And now we're going to head over into our index.cshtml. So this is again under our views, and then the home directory index.cshtml. So I'm going to create a div here with a class of MDL grid. And then I'm going to create sort of 3 cards to sort of go across the screen, and we'll have links to each of the areas of our application there. And for the sake of expediency, I'm just going to go ahead and paste those here as well. So it is sort of 3 identical sections here. One for our library catalog. So we'll have a card for that. And then we have some supporting text here that says view and manage library assets. And as you can see again, we're using our ASP controller and ASP action tag helpers once again. And so yeah, I just have the 3 sections here, one for the catalog, one for patrons, and one for branches. And so feel free to type this yourself or just go ahead and grab the template from the GitHub repo, the link to which should be in the description. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save, and then we'll revisit our page, and I'll just reload it. And so yeah, so we have these 3 sort of material design type cards that have shown up now, and I just need to provide the background image for each of these here. So you'll notice in the code that I have IDs on each of the sort of cards that we have. So I've got an ID catalog, an ID patrons, and an ID branches. So if we head over into our style sheet and we just go ahead and see if I've defined those already. So you can see that I have them here. So we have the hashtag selector to select that ID, and then I'm specifying a background with a URL to images/books.jpg. So this is by default going to look in our images directory here. That's in our www root folder for our static files. And it looks like I've brought over images of our books, but I have not brought over images for each of our 3 front page icons. So I'm going to go ahead and drop those images in this directory now. So what I'm going to do is just using Windows Explorer, head over into our project, and then in the web project, and then in our www root directory, which again contains our static files, and then images, I'm just going to go ahead and paste those images here. So mine are labeled patron, catalog, and BLDG for building, and you can see that I'm referencing them here in our style sheet as well. Feel free to find images of your own. I actually just pulled those off of Pexels, I believe, which contains a whole bunch of images that are in the public domain that you can use for creative projects. And while we're in here, I'm also going to create a new directory called libraries. And I'll just go ahead and paste the images that I have for those in here as well. And we can view those a little bit larger. So just some pictures I have for our various library branches. And if you notice these 1, 2, and 3 file names, they correspond to the static data that we have in our database. So if we select start from library branches, for instance, per the script that we ran a few minutes ago, you can see that we have an image URL property on each of our branch records. And so we're going to use that to actually drive the image that gets shown on the detail view for each of these branches here in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize everything here. And we can close out of our styles. We can head back actually to our application. And I'll go ahead and reload the page. And yeah, you can see the images are coming back. Looks like there's an issue with our library catalog, where it's expecting to have a background image of books.jpg. If we head over into our folder, I didn't actually bring that over, so let me go ahead and copy that last file back in. So there we go, and if I refresh the page, yes, we can see it appear. Okay, cool. So now if we select View Catalog, you can see in the URL at the bottom of the browser window that we're going to hit the index action on the catalog controller. And so that's working properly. We can head back home, and let's see what happens if we click on our patrons. So we just have a blank page. So let's go ahead and get this worked out. I'm going to close the browser window for now, and we can close all of our Windows Explorer windows as well. And we'll minimize our static files directory. That should be pretty much complete at this point. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is to go ahead and create our Patron controller. And rather than have Microsoft MVC scaffold that out for us, for instance, if we were to select controller here, I'm just going to create an empty C# file because I found that to be quite a bit easier. And we're going to call it Patron Controller. And so all we really need to do is to make our Patron Controller extend the controller base class. And then if we control period here, we can bring in the Microsoft ASP NET Core.mvc namespace. And then we'll go ahead and just build out our constructor. So we'll have a Patron Controller. And similar to our other controllers, if you recall, so our catalog controller anyway, you can see that we were implementing these interfaces here. So we were passing this controller an interface so that it could implement the methods that we have defined on that interface. And so this is, again, dependency injection working for us here. So I had some questions previously about dependency injection in the comments in a previous video, and wondering, for instance, why don't we inject a concrete class here, so an implementation of one of these interfaces. So our catalog controller, for instance, if we take this as an example, our catalog controller says that it needs some methods that return various library assets, for instance, or various library checkouts. It needs access to the methods that we have defined on these interfaces. It doesn't care actually how we get this data. So if we were to, for instance, actually instantiate something that implemented iLibrary asset here, so an actual class in our controller, then we're kind of tightly coupling the behavior of this controller to the methods that are on that specific implementation of this library asset interface. And we don't necessarily want to do that. We want to keep everything loosely coupled and give the controller only what it needs. And the controller only needs anything that implements the methods that we define on this interface. So in this case, we have a connection to our DB context that's defined in the library service classes that are defined in our service layer down in this project in the service layer. So notice that we're not actually we don't have any reference to our library context, our DB context, up in our controller. So in this way, with dependency injection and this sort of loose coupling, we could more easily create tests because we don't have to worry about having a connection to a specific DB context here, and we could also more easily decouple our controller, our web layer here, from anything that provides it data. So I could write an API, for instance, which implemented the library asset interface, and I wouldn't actually need to change anything in the controller. I would simply need to change the dependencies that get injected into the controller, and we handle all of that in our startup class. And so I'm going to scroll down here, and you can see that in this configure services method in our startup class, we are calling this services.addScoped, or in one case add singleton. But this is actually going to create the binding between the classes that implement the interface and the interfaces themselves. So you can see that we're adding a scoped service here, our library asset service, anytime we are asking for an implementation of the methods that are defined on that class. And so in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to add more classes to our service layer here in order to pull back the patrons and the branches, for instance. So it's just a brief aside about dependency injection in .NET Core here. And in a future video, when we write some tests for this application, which if you were building something from the ground up, you would definitely consider writing first. In any case, we'll look at how we can actually inject mock implementations of these for our tests. So yeah, I found it to be a really nice design pattern, I think, at least a really practical one. And I'll post a link in the description for some more material on dependency injection if you'd like to read a little bit more about it. Okay, so moving on, we have created our Patron controller now, and we started writing the constructor for it. And so what I want to do is, similar to our catalog controller, in which we had a checkouts and an asset service, I'm going to go ahead and write a patron service. So under our library services project, I'm going to go ahead and add a new item, and we're going to call it patron service. So this is going to be a public class, of course, and it's going to implement iPatron, so our patron interface. And if you recall, we define our interfaces in the data project. So I'm going to come here, and if you recall, for instance, we had this iCheckout interface and iLibrary asset, and now we're going to add a new interface. And I will actually select interface this time, and we're going to go ahead and call it iPatron. Okay, so this is a public interface, and I'm going to go ahead to the top here and control period to clean up usings. And now let's just go ahead and define the methods that we'll have on this interface. So first of all, the very simplest one here is we'll have a patron, and we'll control period to bring in the reference to our library data models. And we'll just have a get method. We'll take an ID, and so that's going to return a particular patron by its primary key. Then we'll have a method to return a collection of patrons, and in fact we'll return all of them with a getAll method, and I'll control period here to bring in collections. Okay, then we'll have a void method that will allow us to add a patron to our database, and that will take a patron object. And then we'll have just a few other methods here that return various types of collections. So if you recall, every patron has a checkout history associated with him or her. So we'll go ahead and write a method for get checkout history, and we'll just pass the patron ID to that method. And we'll have two more methods here to pull back the patron's holds and the patron's checkouts. So that way we can write methods that will implement in our controllers to get some data about an individual patron, or add a patron to our database if we want to create a new user of our system. So with that, let's go back and take a look again at our patron service. So we'll control period here on iPatron to go ahead and bring in the correct namespace here, and we'll control period once again to automatically implement this interface. And so that's kind of nice that Visual Studio will implement all these methods for us, and of course it's just going to throw an exception until we define the behavior of each of these methods. So we are in our patron service class. This is where we actually need a reference to our DB context, and so I'll create a private library DB context. And this will just be the field that we use to actually store the context. Oops, sorry, what did I call our context? If we head over into one of our other services, so I just called it LibraryContext, okay. And then we'll go ahead and implement it in our constructor. So every time we have a patron service, we have our LibraryContext, and we'll go ahead and set it here. All right, cool. So we've been through this once before, but we'll go ahead and go through it again here for our patron now. So anytime we want to add a patron, we can simply call context.add and pass it that new patron object. And Entity Framework is smart enough to know that that belongs within our patron table when it writes that insert. And all we need to do is simply call save changes. And something else I believe I mentioned in a previous video, if you have more complex insert or update or delete behavior within your service layer, then you just want to mind where you're calling save changes so that you don't have some unexpected behavior if you throw an exception while working through a number of different functions. So it's probably ideal to think about just calling save changes once after you've completed one sort of unit of work, if you will. Okay, so then down in our get method, what we're going to do is to simply return context.patrons, and we're going to include, in order to eager load our patron library card, and I believe we need to control period here to bring in Entity Framework Core as well. And I'll change my delegate syntax here in order to make it more clear as to what's happening. So we have this patron. We want to include their library card data, which is a navigation property on that patron object. And we also want to include their home library branch. And then we'll simply call first or default. And I'll control period here to bring link in. And we want to grab the first or default case where the patron ID is equal to the ID that we pass our get method. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out to separate lines here so it's a little bit more readable. Yeah, so we're looking in our patrons database table, for instance. And that's going to correspond to our patrons DB set, or I should say, this is our patrons DB set, and it corresponds to our patron table in our SQL database. And then by calling include and grabbing the library card and home library branch on the patron objects that get returned, we're actually going to include that data in our query results. And then we're calling first or default because we just want to grab one patron from the collection that gets returned, and we want to grab the patron that corresponds to the ID that we pass our get method. So the patron with the primary key that we pass this method will be the one that we return from this query. Okay, and so now we have this get all method, which you can see is actually just the first part of the query that we just wrote here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste. And then we can immediately refactor this a little bit by simply calling return get all, and then dot first or default, where the patron ID is equal to the ID that we pass in this method. And now let's look at our get checkout history method for a particular patron. So in order to get a checkout history, we want to first figure out what that current patron's card ID is, because we associate checkouts with cards, and so we're going to look that up first. So we'll store that as a variable, and we'll just call it card ID. And we'll look in our patrons DB set, and we could use get all here, but I'm just going to write it out for now because we don't actually need to include the home library branch, for instance. It would probably be just as fast to write get all here, considering that our home library branch object should be pretty small, but theoretically I guess it could grow. And so we're just going to pull back what we need, which is probably better designed anyway. So we're going to include the patron's library card. And of course, we just want to return the first or default patron. Who has this primary key. And from there, we want to actually now use that navigation property, that library card, and grab its ID. So we get the patron from our patron DB set, and from that query we are including the library cards, so we can call .librarycard.id after we get the first or default patrons, in other words the only patron who has this primary key from our query. So now that we have that patron's library card ID, we can actually look into our checkout histories, and we'll go ahead and also include the library card and include the library asset navigation property. And now we can use a where clause here, still using this method chaining syntax, where the library card.id is equal to the card ID that we just looked up. And let's go ahead and order that directly in our query as well. So I like to actually order we'll order it by checked out, descending. So we'll get our earliest checkouts first in this checkout history list. I like to do all the ordering sort of as close as possible to the data, and then if it needs to be ordered in some way differently downstream, then I can handle it at that point, but I like to be explicit in the way that the order that's returned from a particular method. And if we were going to do some type of pagination, then we could get more clever with this by doing like take and skip as well. But for now, just simply ordering it should suffice. Now we just want to get the checkouts and the holds for a particular patron by their ID. And I'm going to grab this code again here to get the card ID. And we're repeating ourselves for now, but we're going to refactor that in just a minute here. And in fact, make this query syntax much simpler and perhaps move it out into a separate method. That might be in a card service, for instance, but we'll simplify it here in just a moment. In any case, to get the checkouts, we are obviously going to go to the checkouts repository. Oops, so we'll go ahead and return this. Excuse me, the checkouts DB set. And I'll include the library card. And the library asset. Where the library card ID is equal to the card ID. Okay, so we're actually going to use the same code for the card ID again here. So you'll notice that what we're doing here when we're grabbing the card ID is going to the patrons and including their library card, and then grabbing the first or default patron corresponding to the patron ID that we passed this method, and then we're simply grabbing the library card navigation property off of it, and then the ID property from that library card object. And so that's actually almost identical to just simply our get method here, which is getting all the patrons. We're just, again, making this one additional include here on the home library branch. And so while it might cost something to eagerly load this home library branch, what I would like to do is implement that when we retrieve our card ID. And you can see that the syntax is then going to be much more readable. So for instance, it's going to just be get patron ID, which again is a reference to the get method that is in this class, which returns a patron with the library card navigation property on it because of its include. And so now I can just call librarycard.id. And so that will replace this entire method chain. So we can go ahead and replace it here as well. So it'll come up. Again, we're getting all of the patrons. That's going to include the library card navigation property on it. And then we're going to grab the first or default corresponding to that primary key. And so then we just have a patron object that we can just grab the library card navigation property from. So finally, we'll just go ahead and use this as we implement the getHolds method, which will return all the holds for this patron. So we'll return context.holds, And again, write our includes where our library card.id is equal to the card ID that we just looked up. And we'll go ahead and order this by descending as well on the day that the hold was placed. All right, so now we have some pretty useful methods here. We are able to get all the holds for a patron, get their checkouts, and get their checkout history, all by looking up their library card ID. And then we have the ability to return an enumerable set of all of the patrons, or a particular patron by his or her ID. And then finally we have the ability to add a patron to our database simply by calling .add and save changes. Okay, very cool. Now we can actually implement that in our Patron controller. So we'll come back here, and we had just written our constructor method here, and now we can actually pass that in a patron interface, which we'll just call patron. And we'll go ahead and bring in the library data namespace, and we'll go ahead and clean up our usings as well. So now let's write our sort of field initializer here for our interface. And then we'll set it here as well. So now we have injected our dependency into our patron controller, and we need to remember to actually include that or a reference to that mapping, if you will, in our setup class. So I'm going to head over to our startup, our startup class, and we're going to add a scoped service here from iPatron to our patron service. Alright, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and close that for now. And then we're finally ready to write our index action result. So we'll create an iAction result index. And so when we visit the index page for our patrons, what we want to do is actually just to have a table that displays all of them. And we won't worry about pagination, server-side pagination or anything. Currently, we have a small enough set of patrons. We just want to actually display that data on a table in our view. So I'm just going to store all of our patrons in a single object here, a single collection, which will be called all patrons. And then I'll use our patron service to get all. So as I mentioned previously with dependency injection here, now as far as the controller is concerned, it just needs a service, once again, that pulls back all of the patrons. It doesn't care at all about what's happening inside of the patron service class that we were just working with. This is just an implementation of what the patron controller requires. So if we wanted to hook this up to a separate database or had a completely different type of backend, as long as we implemented these methods, we'd be fine. Likewise, if we wanted to mock out what we were injecting into our controller here, we could also do that as well. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a view models. We'll call it patron models, and we'll set it to all patrons, and then we're going to use a link to actually select that into a new patron detail model. So we'll have this collection of patron detail models such that when we click on any one of them, we'll actually be taken to a page for that particular detail model. So our detail models are lightweight enough that we can kind of use them as the listing object on this page. So we'll say select, and for simplicity, I'll just call the delegate P, and then we'll go ahead and create a new patron detail model for each of those objects in the collection that gets returned. And then in order to make the file happy, I'll go ahead and bring in a link. And we'll need to create a patron detail model now. So this will be the M in our MVC. So if we head into our models directory here that's in our web project, I'm going to go ahead and right click and add a new folder called patron. And I probably should have called the checkout folder checkout instead of checkout models, but that's okay. And I'm going to add a class patron detail model. And so we'll have a set of properties here that will represent everything that we would want to know about a patron and display in our view, or in any number of our views. So first of all, we'll have an ID, because we'll need to actually reference that in order to visit a detail page for a particular patron. And then we'll have a first name, a last name, and those of course should be strings. We'll have a library card ID. We'll have an address. We'll have a datetime object represent since when they've been a member, or like a created at type property. Okay. We'll store their telephone number as a string. We'll store their home library branch name as a string. We'll have some overdue fees that they might owe. We'll store that as a decimal. And then we'll have a few different collections here. So we'll have their set of checkouts. And we'll just call that assets checked out. And we just need to go ahead and bring in collections as well as a reference to our library data models. And then we'll have a collection of checkout histories. And we can just call that checkout history. And then finally, we'll have a collection of holds. So these models could grow. Again, these are view models, so they're not actually going to necessarily map to anything in our database, and they won't be concerned with our migrations. So if you remember, we're in our web layer now. So our controllers are sort of receiving data from our back end, and then either in the model layer here or in our controller, depending on where you like to sort of construct your logic, you're sort of wrangling all of that data that's coming from, in our case, a database, into various useful properties for ways to display information to the end user. And just to show you an example of that we could actually implement in the model, and this is, I suppose, kind of personal preference, but say I wanted to do something very simple like return a full name rather than just a first and last name. I wouldn't personally necessarily want to do that in the controller level if it's just a matter of simply combining two strings here with a space in between them. So I might have something like a public string full name, and what I would do is then inside of this method I could just call get, and we could return first name plus a space plus last name. And so of course this isn't actually stored in our database, but first and last name are, and so in this way we have a view model representation of a patron's full name. So this could be something as an example that you could use in your view model layer, if you will. So the body of our get accessor here is sort of like a method, at least it sort of resembles a method. Which is why I kind of wrote it like that. Often you'll see it written all sort of on one line as well, so you may see this. But the execution of our sort of get accessor here is essentially just equal to reading the value of the field. And in fact, this is a bit of an aside, but the way that we declare properties here, at least in the current version of C#, is rather nice, because it's shorthand for, I guess, the way that the syntax used to be, and you could still write it this way. It's just that this accessor syntax, as we've written it here for our properties, is shorthand. So we might have some fields, say a private string foo, and then we'll have like the property foo with our getter like this, where we would return foo. So this, and then for our set accessor, we would have like foo is equal to value. So I think you would also agree that the shorthand for our properties here is actually quite nice, as is the ability to use our get accessor here, sort of like a method to return some computed value. Alright, cool. So let's create one more model here in our patron folder. So that's in our models and then patron, and we're going to add a new class and we'll call this one our patron index model. And this is just going to have a single property on it. I know that this might not seem like, or it may seem like overkill, but we're going to have an enumerable collection here of a patron detail model. Oops, we'll call this patrons. And this is what I'm going to actually return to the patron index view. Now I could actually just directly return this collection of patron detail models to the index view, but I tend to prefer to have a view model for each of my views. Again, not the biggest deal, but rather than just pass that index, the collection directly, I'll pass it a reference to a patron index model which has this collection on it. Okay, so back to our patron controller. We should now have access to our patron detail model. So if I control period, I'll bring in the using. And now in our select statement here, I just need to create some mappings. So the ID on the patron detail model will be equal to the patron ID that comes back from our getAll query. And so the link select statement, as we had used it previously, but just to recap, this is actually just going to be a basic mapping. So you can think of it almost as like a dot map. It is going to essentially project each element that's in the sequence of getAll in our collection of getAll into a new instance of a patron detail model. And so each member of that collection will have an ID. We'll have a first and last name. We'll have our library card ID. So we have the library card object on our getAll because we use that include to eager load that navigation property. We've got our overdue fees, which is stored on our library card. And we have our home library branch, which is just on our home library branch.name. And if you recall, we included the library branch navigation property as well on our getAll method in the service layer. That's looking good. I'm going to go ahead and enumerate this to a list. And then we'll construct our actual view model for this view. We'll just call that model, and it'll be a new patron index model. If you recall, we had a single property on that model, which was an enumerable set of our patron detail models, which we have just constructed. And we called it patrons, and so we'll set it equal to patron models. And now we'll just go ahead and return the view and pass it our patron index model. Okay, so now that we have an index action in our controller, we are actually ready to create a view. So under our views folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called patron. And I'm going to create a new file here. You could also select view, but I just prefer to do these manually because I don't actually typically like what gets scaffolded out. So we're going to go ahead and select web to make it easier. And we'll select MVC view page, and we'll call it index.cshtml. So at the top of our view, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this, and we need to define our model with this at model with a lowercase n, so our model directive here, and we'll say that it's going to be our library.models.patron index model. And so I'll go ahead and create our viewbag.title. It's equal to patron index. It's not really necessary, but just to show, and we'll go ahead and create our heading here. And then we'll have an ID patron index. And we'll go ahead and just create a simple table. And we'll use some of the material design classes here. And then I have this custom table class as well. Go ahead and provide an ID, which will be a patron index table. And so we'll have our head and our body. And in the head, we have a row of table headings where we'll have a link to the user's profile. We'll have their full name, have their library card ID, In fact, I think it might make more sense to actually, in this case, actually show their last name and their first name, because perhaps you wanted to just quickly sort on like the patron's last name, which might be a common thing to do. I'll just have a column for that. Otherwise, we could format that full name read-only property that we had in our model as like last name comma first name instead of first name plus space plus last name. But that's just a different way that you could do things. Then we'll have overdue fees and the home library for this particular patron. And then using razor syntax here, we can say for each patron in our model.patrons. So our model contains one property on it, and it's that collection of patrons that we selected our getAll method from the database into. And for each of the patrons in that enumerable set, we'll have a new table row. And so we'll have a link here, again with our tag helpers. We use the ASP Controller patron, and we're going to write another action called detail. And then if you recall, we can make use of our ASP route ID tag helper in order to pass it the patron ID. So our detail action will take a primary key from a patron in order to build out the detail view. And we could replace this with like a font awesome link or some other type of icon, a font awesome icon. But for now, I'm just going to say profile in parens here, and we could change that out in the future. So we'll close our anchor tag, we'll close the data tag here. And in fact, I need to create a TD in the front. Okay, and then we just can simply call each of the properties that we need to off of the remaining columns. So we got first and last name, we've got library card ID, overdue fees, and home library branch. So that should look pretty good. The only thing we haven't done now regarding our patron is to create the detail page. So for now, what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and fire up the application again. And so we'll click on View Patron Index. And so now we have a nice table here with each of our patrons as well as their library card ID and overdue fees. If we click on a profile link, it will currently not lead anywhere. So we'll go back. And if you're curious, you can also just kind of spot check the results of your link queries here in SQL. So we can see, for instance, that the patron with library card ID 1 has $12 in overdue fees and has a home library of Lakeshore Branch. So if we head over into SQL, for instance, let's go ahead and select star from patrons, and then we can just interjoin library card C on C.ID is equal to, we'll alias patrons with P.library card ID, and we'll also interjoin library branches B on B.ID is equal to P.home library branch ID, where C.ID, the card ID for Jane Patterson here was 1, so C.ID is equal to 1. And so yeah, we can see all of her data here corresponds. So she's got $12 in fees, and we've got the Lakeshore branch. Likewise, if we grab, say, the customer with library card ID 7, we can see that this is Raj Prasad with $0 in fees, library card ID 7, belonging to the Lakeshore branch as well. So you can see that our link query is, at least seems to be at this point, operating with our database data as would be expected. Okay, so let's quickly wire up the profiles. This will be the detail views on our patron object. So we're going to go back to the controller, patron controller. We already have the patron detail view model that we can use. And so now, in addition to our index action, we can also go ahead and write a detail action. For that, we need to stop the server. So we'll have this iActionResult detail, which in this case, we actually want to pass a patron ID. And so we know how to get a particular patron record back from our database now using our patron service. We can just call .get and pass it the patron ID. So now that we have access to our patron object, we can simply use it to build out a new patron detail model. And so I'm just going to go ahead and quickly fill out all the properties here. Now for our assets checked out, that's not going to be a property that's actually on our patron object that gets returned from our database. We actually need to invoke our patron service again in order to grab all of that data. So we'll pass the patron ID to our getCheckouts method and then enumerate it with toList. And if it's null, then we'll just return an empty list of checkout. And I'll control period to bring that in from our data models. Likewise, I need to bring in collections. Same sort of thing with our checkout history. We need to use the patron service to get checkout history, passing it our patron ID. Okay, so that should be rather simple. Now we can just actually return this model to our detail view, and then we can create our detail view. So under patron, we'll go ahead and add a new item, call it detail. And again, at the top of this file, we're going to have @model library.models.patron detail model this time. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste in this view for the sake of time here, and then we can review it. So I've got a container, and then I've got a header here with some text that says patron information. And then rather than @model first name and last name, we can actually use that computed property full name here perhaps. And then I have a div with some contact information on that patron where we present their library card ID, address, telephone number, their member since and date, and then this should be home library branch. And then we have this little if-else block, again using some Razor syntax, and what we say is if their overdue fees are greater than 0, so if they have some overdue fees, then we have a div where we display the current fees which are due. Otherwise, we say no fees are due, and then by supplying some ID to these divs, we can then dynamically style them, if you will, just using some CSS. We could obviously handle that in JavaScript as well, and perhaps maybe even a little bit more elegantly than using this, but just showing you how you can use Razor syntax in these views. Now if I just scroll down here, so we'll have a new column here, and I'm kind of mixing in some Bootstrap here for these columns, which you may have noticed. So we're using a row and the Jumbotron from Bootstrap, and then these with 4 columns. And so in the second column here, I'm displaying that the assets that the patron currently has checked out, and I'm using another if-else block here to say that if there are any assets checked out, then we have this div containing the patron assets, and I'm just going to loop through each of their assets checked out and display some information about each of those assets in a very simple unordered list. Otherwise, we just simply say no assets are checked out, and we drop that in just a plain vanilla div. And then in our last column here, we have another if-else block for the patron's holds. So very similar logic. If the patron has any holds, then iterate through them and show when the hold was placed along with the title. And I'll go ahead and take a look at the end of this line, and so you can see when the hold was placed, and we're just calling toString on this datetime object here to do some sort of string formatting down in the view. Now that may or may not be your preferred practice. In fact, if I were to write this again, I might actually just convert that to a string in the controller and then just pass the view exactly what the data it needs rather than have the view do any of this kind of work. So we can move that back up into the controller if you prefer. Again, otherwise don't show any items and instead just display that they have no items on hold. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Again, if you would like to copy this directly, feel free to do that. Otherwise, take a look at the link to the GitHub repository in the description. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire up the application again. And now we'll select View Patron Index. And now if I select one of the profile links here, we are actually, looks like we're throwing an error where we have a null reference exception. And so it looks like our patron ID, if we hover over it, is actually 0. And so we're basically going to have null reference exceptions on all these properties. So let's go back to our view and see if we can't figure out what's going on. So we'll click continue and we'll get an error here. So let's go ahead and go back. And if I'm hovering over each of the links, I can see that in the URL that it's actually displaying the correct ID for each of the links. But what is not happening is that when our detail action gets called, this patron ID is not actually getting passed properly. So if you recall, we actually saw an error like this in the previous video, I believe, where the Razor template didn't actually map patron ID, in this case, to the patron ID that we're passing into the detail here. So we can see what's going on here if we head into the index view for our patrons. And here we have this ASP route ID is equal to @patron.id. So .NET MVC is actually expecting, I believe probably expecting the parameter that we pass detail here to be ID rather than patron ID is what I suspect. And so I'm just going to go ahead and change references to that as well. And I can just do that using Vim very quickly. Okay, so we've saved that, and now I'm going to start the application up again. Alright, so we'll select View Patron Index, and we'll click on this patron. And so yeah, now you can see that we are actually getting information about our patron. And we can see the current fees that she has due, telephone number, address, this sort of thing. We can also see the full name displayed here. So you can imagine if you wanted to elaborate on this and you had some other type of system where you were, say, storing like a photo of the patron, then you could include a photograph here. And for that, you would just use actually similar syntax to what we'll use for the library branch. So we'll look at that actually in the next video. So that concludes this particular video. I tried to actually complete the application all in this final part 4, but in fact I will be making a part 5 in order to finish out our library branches. That should go quite a bit more quickly than this video. And then actually to follow up on the next video, we'll also start writing some unit tests. And then in a video down the line, as I mentioned at the start of this video, I'd like to create a project and another series to show you how to actually write an automated testing framework in which you can use NUnit and Selenium with the Koipu C# API. And so all that should be a lot of fun. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you next time when we wrap up writing branches. As always, leave comments and questions below, and if you're getting anything out of this series, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed or consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue making these videos for free. So all the best, and I'll catch you next time.